The wind howled across the empty prairie like a lonely ghost searching for something it had lost long ago. Dust swirled around a tiny patch of land where nothing but stubborn weeds dared to grow. At the edge of that barren land stood a crooked little shack, made from broken boards, rusted nails, and pieces of wood that looked like they had once belonged to a barn that had collapsed years earlier. The shack looked fragile, as if one strong storm could tear it apart. But inside it lived someone even more fragile. Her name was Emily Carter, a young woman who had traveled thousands of miles with nothing but hope in her heart. She had come west as a mail-order bride, answering a letter from a man she believed would become her husband. The letter had promised a home, safety, and a new life. Instead, when the train stopped and she stepped onto the dusty platform, the man who had written the letter looked at her with cold disappointment. "You're not what I expected," he had said. Those words were the first crack in her dream. By sunset that same day, the man had already chosen another woman who arrived on the next train. Emily was left standing alone with a single suitcase and nowhere to go. The town was small, harsh, and unkind to strangers. People looked at her with pity at first, then indifference. A few offered advice. Best go back east, find work in another town. But going back east meant admitting she had failed. It meant returning to the life she had tried so hard to escape. So she stayed. With the little money she had left, she bought a handful of old boards from a carpenter who was clearing junk behind his shop. For 3 days and 3 nights, Emily worked alone on the edge of town. Her hands blistered, her dress tore on sharp wood, the nails bent under her shaking hammer. But piece by piece, board by board, she built a tiny shack. It leaned slightly to one side. The roof had gaps where rain could sneak through. But it was shelter. It was hers. Every night she sat beside a small fire outside the shack and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow will be better." Yet the loneliness was heavy. Some nights the coyotes howled in the distance, and Emily wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. And then one afternoon, everything changed. A lone rider approached from the western hills. His horse moved slowly, kicking up small clouds of dust. The man in the saddle wore a dark hat that shadowed his eyes, and a long coat fluttered behind him like a flag in the wind. This was Daniel Hayes. Around the territory, people called him the Quiet Cowboy. Daniel had spent most of his life riding alone. He worked cattle, fixed fences, and kept to himself. Trouble seemed to avoid him, perhaps because he carried the calm confidence of a man who had seen enough hardship to recognize it from miles away. As Daniel rode past the edge of town, something unusual caught his eye. A crooked shack made from broken boards, and beside it, a woman struggling to lift a heavy beam onto the roof. He slowed his horse. For a moment, he simply watched. The wind pushed strands of Emily's hair across her tired face. Her hands trembled as she tried again to lift the wood. It slipped. The beam fell. Emily sighed and sat down on the ground, clearly exhausted. Daniel frowned slightly. Most people in town would have ridden past without thinking twice. But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he turned his horse toward the shack. Emily heard the hoofbeats and looked up quickly, fear flashing in her eyes. A lone cowboy approaching a woman living alone on the prairie could mean many things, and not all of them good. The horse stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel studied the broken shack, the scattered tools, and the fresh blisters on Emily's hands. "You build this yourself?" he finally asked. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked at the crooked roof again. Then he slowly stepped off his horse. Without another word, he walked over, lifted the fallen beam easily, and placed it onto the frame of the roof. Emily blinked in surprise. You don't have to help," she said softly. Daniel shrugged. "Looks like you could use a hand." For the next hour, the Quiet Cowboy worked beside her. He reinforced the walls, straightened the roof, secured loose boards. Emily watched in amazement as the fragile shack slowly began to look stronger. But what surprised her most wasn't his skill. It was his kindness. He never asked for payment. He never asked questions. He simply helped. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and gold, Daniel hammered the final nail into the roof. He stepped back and examined the shack. "It'll hold through the next storm," he said. Emily felt something warm in her chest, something she hadn't felt since arriving in the West. "Hope. Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded once and turned toward his horse. But before he mounted the saddle, he paused. His eyes drifted across the lonely land around the shack. Then he looked back at Emily. And what he said next would change both of their lives forever. But before we continue the story, take a quick moment to subscribe to the channel and join us for more powerful Wild West stories of courage, hope, and unexpected heroes. Because this story is only beginning, the prairie had grown quiet as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the land, and the air carried the cool breath of night. Emily stood beside her little shack, watching the cowboy who had just repaired the roof. She expected him to ride away like everyone else eventually did, but Daniel Hayes did something unexpected. He walked back toward her. "You got food?" he asked calmly. Emily hesitated a little. Daniel glanced toward the empty land around the shack. "This place gets rough at night." Emily forced a small smile. "I'll be all right." Daniel studied her for a moment, clearly unconvinced. Then he untied a small leather bag from his saddle and tossed it gently toward her. Emily caught it. Inside were dried meat, beans, and a small loaf of bread. Her eyes widened. "I can't take this." "Sure you can," Daniel replied simply. "But why?" Daniel paused before answering. "Because someone should have helped you sooner." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. No one had said anything kind to her since she arrived. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly and mounted his horse. Then he turned and began riding away. Emily watched him disappear into the fading light, wondering if she would ever see him again. But the next morning, Daniel came back. This time he carried tools. He rebuilt the door, fixed the window, strengthened the foundation. He didn't say much. He simply worked. Day after day, the quiet cowboy returned. The shack slowly transformed. Soon it had a proper roof, solid walls, and even a small porch. The townspeople began whispering, "Why's Daniel helping that girl?" But Daniel ignored them. One evening, as they sat beside the fire outside the shack, Emily finally asked the question that had been in her heart. "Why are you doing all this?" Daniel stared into the flames. "Because I know what it feels like to be left alone." For the first time, he told her about his past, the family he had lost, the ranch that had burned, and the years he had spent wandering the West. Emily listened quietly. Two lonely souls on the same prairie. Then Daniel looked at the little house they had built together. "You shouldn't have to fight the world by yourself," he said. Emily felt her heart race. "And you?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "Maybe I shouldn't either." The wind rustled the grass around them as silence filled the night. Finally, Daniel stood and brushed the dust from his coat. "There's something else we need to build tomorrow." Emily looked confused. "What?" Daniel smiled faintly. "A real home." Months later, travelers passing through the prairie often noticed a small ranch where a crooked shack once stood. There was a sturdy house, a garden, and two horses tied near the fence. People sometimes saw a quiet cowboy repairing fences while a woman laughed nearby. The woman who had once built a shack from broken boards. The cowboy who had simply stopped and helped. And together, they built something neither of them thought they'd ever have again. A life, a home, and a future.